From Sonny Angel collections to drawers of makeup and skincare that we can't possibly use before their expiry dates, or shoes and clothes or plants, or even the photos that we have on our camera roll or the playlist that we store on Spotify, it's no doubt that we live in a collecting culture right now. We love to acquire little things and to have those things as our possessions and to have those things represent us as individuals. In fact, a lot of people suggest that what's in a woman's bag says a lot about who they are as an individual. What about what's in your bedroom? This says even more. Or what do you collect? Again, it says a lot about who you are as a person, or we like to think it says a lot about who we are as people. But I want to look into this a little bit deeper today. So let's talk about the ways that big corporations are using these collector marketing techniques to try and convince you that you do need collections of more than one of a product that was never designed to be collected in the first place. And let's talk about whether or not collecting culture really does foster community when it's in this one in every color consumption way, or whether it actually fosters a further disconnection from the people who ultimately end up making those products, particularly when they're being mass produced. From the Diving Board is a show hosted by me, Charlie Chats, dedicated to decoding digital culture by unpacking the hidden politics behind the screen. Hey guys, welcome back to my channel and to my podcast. So exciting. Today I spent a ridiculous number of hours, like I'm not even kidding, hours, reorganizing this bookshelf so that it would look nice for the backdrop, which is actually quite ironic if you've watched one of my recent videos on performative reading, because clearly I'm not practicing what I preach, okay? This is very performative behavior from me. So we're just gonna have to leave that to one side and acknowledge the cognitive dissonance that exists within every individual and human. Actually, that kind of leads me into this video, because this video is a little bit, we're talking about cognitive dissonance, we're talking about overconsumption, we're talking about collecting things. We're talking about a lot of similar things actually. So a nice little segue if I do say so myself. Although I've never considered myself a collector, if I had a look in my wardrobe right now, it would literally be busting at the seams with secondhand clothes that, I've got to be honest with myself, a lot of that I have not worn in the last 12 months, but I can't bear to part with it because I love those items so much. Or what about that collection of nail polish that I've had sitting in my bathroom for the past 10 to 15 years, including a heinous shade of yellow? You heard that right, yellow. I bought that when I was 10, clearly to complete some sort of rainbow situation I had going on. Although it pains me to think that there was a part of me that potentially was buying that to wear it, but I'm putting that to one side of my brain because God help me if that was the case. I say this to say that I consider myself anti-consumerist and I dislike overconsumption, and yet my behaviors don't necessarily suggest the same. The cognitive dissonance, again, is loud. Whether we like to admit it or not, we do love collecting things. We love organizing things, arranging things. It gives us this oddly satisfying feeling. Many of us are obsessed with materiality, and unfortunately, it's no longer something to be singing super proudly of when we have a Great Pacific garbage patch in the ocean of over 1.6 million square kilometers in size, and big corporations are constantly profiting off of and promoting further hyper-consumerism and hyper-consumption. Collector culture has been around for years though. It's not a modern phenomenon. In fact, it's actually been a human behavior since 12,000 years ago, when hunter-gatherers would try and gather, literally, says it in the name. Hunter-gatherers would collect supplies just in case next week it was going to be a rainy day and they wouldn't be able to go out and hunt. In fact, it was also a mating technique. The women were saying, get me a man who can find resources. For many, it's not just the act of purchasing these collectible items and neatly arranging them on our mantelpieces or on our bookshelves, but it's the humanity that exists behind and represents each object. If you collect handmade ceramics, for example, there's a good chance one of the reasons you like doing that is because you know that someone ultimately made that. All the marks on that mug were made by a person, by another human. It's representative of some sort of connection that you have with the product's designer and creator. Or what about people who collect secondhand stamps? Sure, they're beautiful, but it also is representative of all the people before who purchased those stamps with the intention of sending letters letters and messages to their loved ones. In an essay I read by Charlie Squire, they said the following: "Collecting is a practice of love and appreciation. It's the antithesis of overconsumption because it champions holding onto and cherishing objects instead of simply throwing them away and buying the next new thing. But when this practice filters into one in every color consumption and walls of Stanley Cups in every different color, even though you only really need one Stanley Cup, arguably, for the function that it purports to have, or racks of bags and shoes in every different color when there's no chance that you'll actually be able to sport those within a given year. Or what about all of that makeup that I was talking about earlier, which is going to expire before you can possibly hit pan on the things you already own? It starts to sound like overconsumption. Well, actually, is it overconsumption, or is it collecting? Or could it be hoarding or archiving? Materialism, or the way that we value material objects in Western society, is highly regarded. Around 33 to 40% of Americans say that they collect one thing or another. It's a pretty common thing to do, even if we don't necessarily think that we do it. And as I said earlier, we've been collecting items since as long as we have been stationary in one place and non-nomadic. It's certainly not a novel concept. To be scientific, the thrill of the hunt in finding something new to add to your collection has actually been associated with the basal ganglia and the middle frontal lobes of the brain. It's associated with your reward system. Now, if you were like me and hadn't researched this topic before and then went to go and research it, Googling why do people collect things, came across Freud's theory, you may have been quite taken aback. Honestly, every time I learn something about that man, which, mind you, I never search in what does Freud think about this, it just comes to me. I don't know what's going on. Why am I attracting Freud theory into my life? Please, some psychic, tell me why. The more I learn about this figure, the more confused, concerned I am about him. I'm not even going to bother repeating it, but it had to do with toilet training. Yeah, the theory behind collecting and why we collect had to do with how we were toilet trained as a child. Leaving that to one side, there are genuine reasons for collecting things that don't involve toilet training, surprisingly. I mean, firstly, and I think this one's pretty common for a lot of people, there's the sentimental and nostalgic value that we attach to objects. As humans, we're able to attach autobiographical memories to different objects, so certain objects might remind us of our early childhood birthdays, of major life events like weddings, of relationships with certain people. People who like to collect items that kind of map out their life or the lives of those before them often do so that they can pass it on as a kind of legacy. Some do say that this is linked to existential anxieties. I mean, there is some comfort in the idea that even if you're not going to be here forever, there's a chance that your collection of items that represent you will be. With this type of collection, there's a huge sense of purpose that many collectors feel when they engage in this type of collecting, which then reinforces their identities as collectors. But then there's other reasons too, such as connecting with other people and social motivations. There are so many forums online of collectors of different objects and items, and in the past it wasn't online but in person as well. Many people like to collect because it connects them with like-minded people, and who wouldn't want to connect with someone who shares the same hobby as you? In fact, this is particularly prevalent right now when we're in a loneliness epidemic and social interaction really feels like it's at an all-time low. And then there are other reasons too, like the fact that for some people, reorganizing and arranging things and adding things to a particular collection makes them feel like they have some sort of control over an aspect of their life that maybe they don't feel like they have much control over at all. But notably, when discussing collecting, it's very important to talk about the different ways that you can accumulate objects, because not everything's collecting, and on the opposite side of the coin, not everything's hoarding. There's a lot of space and nuance in between, so I wanted to unpack that a little bit here. For example, hoarding differs from collecting because the accumulation of objects typically hinders the person's normal performance. In fact, this can occur to the extent that hoarding disorder has been added to the DSM-5 as a psychological condition. Similarly to collectors, those with hoarding disorders tend to describe an attachment attachment with their possessions and objects. Unlike those with hoarding disorder, collectors tend to consider their accumulation of objects as something that greatly benefits their livelihoods and their lives. And I think it's really important to note here that hoarding disorder can be triggered by traumatic life events and stresses. And while that person may desperately want to get rid of the possessions that they've accumulated, these traumas and stresses can make it really, really hard to let go of those possessions. But different again is compulsive buying, or sometimes known as chronic impulse buying, which is essentially where a person seeks to purchase objects as a response to negative emotions or stresses in their lives. However, after purchasing a number of different items, usually it followed with high levels of guilt and negative emotions, which further reinforce the desire to spend further money. This cycle means that some researchers have even considered it from an addiction paradigm, coining the term shopping addiction. During the pandemic, due to high levels of distress and social isolation, levels of compulsive buying increased quite significantly. There was a study that showed that a lot of collectors turned to compulsive buying when they were feeling particularly distressed and isolated, which unfortunately led to negative emotions about their hobby. The negative emotions then reinforced the desire to compulsively buy. So this demonstrates that not all of these different ways of accumulating objects are mutually exclusive. In fact, they most certainly can overlap. So I think looking at this with some nuance is really important. Now, although all of these ways of accumulating objects are quite different, they all at their core have a strong emotional connection to material objects, which is interesting under capitalism. For any company that's trying to sell an object, if you manage to hit a collector community, you ultimately strike gold. I mean, who wouldn't want a loyal customer base that wants to keep coming back for more and different iterations of essentially the same product, or a loyal consumer base who's consistently waiting for the next item to add to their collection of existing items that they already own from you? Especially when you throw social media platforms like TikTok into the mix, which give you the opportunity to go viral and then expand this customer base drastically, even exponentially sometimes. Something that I find quite interesting about modern day collecting culture, I suppose, is that historically collecting was considered quite an elite hobby. I mean, think of art collectors, stamp collectors. It was a hobby that was very much linked with class and wealth. And we even see this trickle down today with the distinction between certain collections. Art collectors, for example, might be considered elite, while collectors of toys might be demeaned. But I think what's worth noting is that collecting has become more accessible, which is a really great thing, particularly with the rise of social media and the ability to accumulate various collectible items for a much lower cost than, say, previously before. The democratization of being able to engage in this hobby is something to celebrate. However, I'm interested in where it starts looking like overconsumption and how you even make that distinction, whether or not that's even possible. The recent popularity of the Sonny Angel, which is a figurine with no pants and different hats, shows that collectible toys have become quite mainstream recently. Over 2023 and 2024, sales for the Sonny Angel have increased dramatically. The toys themselves don't have any utility other than the ability to bring happiness, as their company quotes that they can do. But I think that their desirability is rooted in nostalgia and sentimental value. They've become particularly popular among Gen Z and millennial women, which is the same group of people who grew up with Barbie dolls, Baby Borns, and American Dolls. But the Sonny Angel isn't new to the collector scene just because it's gained significant popularity with TikTok. In fact, it was actually designed and first made in 2004 by Toru Soya, who made the toys for women working during a mild recession in Japan. The big kicker, though, is the fact that you don't know what you're going to get when you buy them. When you unbox these items, you may understand kind of what theme they're going to come from, but you won't know exactly what toy you're going to get. And this dramatically increases dopamine levels. And then add in the chance that you'll get a Robbie Angel, which is an unspecified animal with a 1 in 144 chance of getting it, and that adds even more dopamine levels to the mix. After unboxing, if you get what you wanted, then awesome, that draws you in for more. If you don't, well, there's always next time. And if you get one that you already have, well, that's fine because there's a huge resale market online and a potential community to trade with. But as I said before, fostering a loyal customer base who are interested in collecting your items is attractive to all companies, not just companies that are creating objects that are designed to be collected. And it's this marketing push, in my view, that really starts to err on encouraging and promoting overconsumption behaviors and overproduction practices. The Stanley Cup is a bizarre example. I think here we're just going to say, I'm not a fan of the Stanley Cup. You may be a fan of the Stanley Cup. Let's both acknowledge our differences and move forward together in harmony, because actually we benefit each other. If I don't buy your Stanley Cups, you get more. So we're just going to become a little union. The non-Stanleys and the Stanleys unite. Let me say my piece though. Sorry if I offend. Designed as a thermos and a reusable drink bottle, despite its humongous size and weight, the company has managed somehow to convince their audience that you need more than one, that in fact, it should be your life goal to accumulate enough Stanley Cups so that you could potentially, if push came to shove, remove enough water from the ocean to restore it to pre-global warming levels. Now, as I said, I'm not here to yuck your yum because I do appear to be among the minority of people who dislike Stanley Cups. And as I said before, we're all here together having a fun party because we each benefit, we mutually benefit from this agreement. So I'm happy to remain in my lane. I'm very comfortable in my hatred for Stanley Cups, and as you should be comfortable in your love for them, okay? Defined as the compulsion to buy new iterations of essentially the same product, at least a product that doesn't change in functionality when the new iteration comes out. One in every color consumption can pretty well describe the phenomenon of purchasing new Stanley Cups when a new color drops or a new collaboration with another company drops. It essentially creates a collector-consumer base where none existed in the first place. In fact, the Stanley Cup was never originally designed to be owned in multiples. Quoting from The Guardian, how did it become normal, or at least not abnormal, to own 100 of something you'd traditionally only need one of? While hyperconsumers are not new, social media has amplified their behavior, allowing it to influence consumption and production. Launched in 2016, the Stanley Cup originally only came in 5 different colors. By 2021, it came in 10. By today, a new color drops almost monthly. The company is quoted that their business has doubled 3 years in a row. This reminds me of that sound that was trending on TikTok.
If I like it, I'll just grab it in a different color. If I like it, I'll just grab it in another color. If I like it and they have another color, I'll just grab it.
TikTok users would play this sound over their collection of various things like lip gloss or different tops or swimwear or Stanley Cups to demonstrate their collections of different objects that they like because they like a particular style. But a lot of people had a lot to say about the way that it promotes overconsumption and hyperconsumerism. It really plays into this idea that our possessions are an extension of ourselves, that we should be engaging in a type of consumerism that allows us to pick out a particular iteration of something depending on our mood that day. For example, if I'm feeling sophisticated, I'm obviously going to get my red Stanley Cup to go with my red Mary Janes. If I'm feeling sad, I'll get my blue one. You get the vibe. According to Evan Malone, the satisfaction of one in every color consumerism plays more to our desire to aesthetically curate our lives. He says it allows companies to invite us to design our own aesthetic life at a cinematic level. We essentially select props that represent us, like characters in a film. For me, as a Gen Z, this really reminds me of playing video games when I was younger, like Star Doll on the computer, where you could change up someone's outfit. Basically, the whole game was changing up the character's outfit. Or when I used to play Sims, the main thing that I would do was either design the house or design the outfit. And if I was feeling a particular way one day, I could go and change my Sims outfit. With this level of hyperconsumerism, the idea is you change your own personal outfit depending on your mood. It's not about this other character. We are the sim. It reminds me of that scene in Clueless where Cher has all the different outfits to choose from. You know the one. I'll put it on the screen. Now, some quote that indeed their Stanley Cup collections have brought them closer to other people who share a similar hobby and a similar love for the Stanley Cup. There's literally a whole section of TikTok called Water Talk where like-minded people just share their Stanley collections essentially. But I think what's often left out of the conversation is the people that we're inherently disconnected to when we hyper-consume in Stanley Cup collections. I mean, we're not very connected to those who made our cups at all. And not to mention the people who deal with the waste if ultimately you decide the collection's not something you really want anymore. And even if you don't ever decide that, are you really passing that on to someone in your family that genuinely wants it, or friends? Like, where's that going when you're no longer here? The irony of the Stanley Cup is that it's designed based on sustainability. And this is where I find a little bit of inner conflict when talking about the company. Because ultimately, I think if you're designed based on sustainability, you're better than the average Joe. But when you're promoting destructive consumption habits, I have to think twice about what's going on here. The Stanley Cup itself was designed out of a desire to try and help with the transition from single-use plastic bottles to reusable bottles. Stanley's committed to using 50% recycled stainless steel by 2025, or this year, and their products are designed to last a lifetime. God help us. But the mass production of anything can't be that sustainable. And I think a good rule of thumb is that as soon as you're having a Stanley Stampede at Target over a new collaboration between a Stanley Cup and, say, Starbucks, I think we're erring into overconsumption territory. The release of limited edition products, not just in Stanley Cups, but across the board, creates this sense of urgency and necessity. It's a scarcity mindset that's being marketed to try and make people feel like they'll miss out. It uses FOMO and people's insecurities of not getting in on the in-group to sell you something that they ultimately make you think you need more of because it's limited in stock. And this is even where you may already own 17 of the same product that fulfill the same functionality. But in the case of Stanley, they've started to market to you that it's not really the functionality that you're looking for, it's the way that the Stanley Cup has now become an accessory for your lifestyle and for who you decide to be, rather than just a cup. Using this mentality that it's an extension of your identity, you can kind of be sold that you need as many different iterations of this thing depending on the many different people you want to be. It suddenly makes you feel like you're more free of an individual. You have more freedom if you have more cups, because there's more people that you can be with all these different cups. This is the exact same type of marketing that fast fashion companies use when they have limited edition drops or collaborations with different influencers that sell out within only a few minutes. This whole notion that there's an in-group and that you want to be a part of it, but you can't because it's sold out. And it's gonna sell out if you don't get on there and wait for like 15 minutes before the drop, or in some cases an hour. It drives overconsumption and fuels people's vulnerabilities and insecurities to further increase the chances that you're going to spend your dollar. Further, in the case of the Stanley Cup, the language of being built for life gives you this illusion that you're buying into something worthwhile, that you're buying into something sustainable and ethical, so you don't feel as guilty after you do spend your money on it. Although some people clearly don't care too much about this sustainability aspect, because I have seen videos of people emptying literally single-use plastic water bottles into their Stanley Cup, which, oh my god, it defeats the whole purpose. The production of stainless steel does produce greenhouse gases and isn't great for the environment. In fact, it produces more so than single-use plastic bottles do. However, researchers from MIT say that if you use your stainless steel reusable bottle 10 to 20 times, you will be more sustainable than if you were to use a new single-use plastic bottle every single day. But if you have a collection of, say, over 100 Stanley Cups, that's going to take you quite some number of days before you actually reach that limit of sustainability. And the reason I'm drilling this down so much is I think it's quite interesting that a company that literally is designed to be sustainable and to promote sustainability has somehow become this overconsumed product, where arguably the people who are collecting or accumulating a large number of Stanley Cups don't really care too much about sustainability, because if they did, I doubt they'd be hyper consuming them in this way. We haven't even spoken about the fact that when you do buy things online in general, that's not good for the environment. Like the emissions from transport and delivery, and what if you don't like it and you have to send it back? If you're buying something like a Stanley Cup once every month, that adds up. And that's just the bottle. We haven't even gotten to the accessories yet. Yes, I did say accessories. Straw covers, tumbler sleeves, charms that hang off the handle, a lunchbox that you add on top, and drum roll please for my favorite, the backpack. Yep, you heard me correctly. The backpack that goes on top of your Stanley Cup, obviously. Duh. These accessories you can buy from Amazon, which certainly isn't a place that cares about sustainability at all. And I think what's really interesting about this is it kind of takes this whole collection thing to the meta level, right? Say you've got Stanley Cups that you already collect, and then items to collect to put on those items that you collect. Oh my God, it's crazy out here. Granted, Stanley does have a recycling program, but a lot of people aren't completely certain that it's really being used, and some people have even considered it a diversionary or greenwashing technique. Ultimately, for many, if they don't keep them forever, because apparently they do last a lifetime, they'll end up in landfill and probably not disintegrate for another millennia or so. This isn't exclusive to Stanley at all, and I'm not trying to pin all of the blame on Stanley, but even with the company Baggu, which essentially makes reusable tote bags to try and overcome the single-use plastics issue, their recent limited edition drop with Sandy Lang saw the collection sell out within minutes, which led to heaps of people online criticizing the company for engaging in this scarcity mindset marketing and production, because a lot of people who purchased the bags didn't really want the bags for themselves, but for their extremely high resale value that they could ultimately sell it on for on sites like StockX. Or what about skincare companies that have benefited from this huge surge in people who are desiring multi-step skincare routines and anti-aging routines? The skincare companies don't care if 10-year-olds are using it, even though that could potentially cause further damage than good for their skin. They're just getting more business, and for the skincare company, which is profit maximizing like any other corporation, it's only really inward looking. It only really cares about finances at the end of the day. I think in this space, the overconsumption of makeup and skincare space, there has been some pushback on TikTok with the whole Project Pan movement and underconsumption core movements, which essentially highlight and promote people using up the products that they already have before buying anything new. Now, if you're not chronically online, this sounds ridiculous because surely this is how most people live. And actually, yes, this is how most people live. Let's not get it twisted. But online, when we're so used to seeing these influencers who are promoting hyper-consumerism, who have drawers and drawers of makeup and shelves of skincare, it's not a very common messaging to actually see online. No, don't buy that, just use what you have. So this is actually very positive and an exciting movement to see, in my opinion. I think it's important to actually look at what we're talking about here when we talk about overconsumption, because in some ways, and sometimes in some contexts, it's not actually always bad. Following 9/11, Americans were encouraged by the government to engage in spending as a patriotic and almost moral act. Spending and putting more money into the American economy was considered as something that would ultimately increase morale, as it would increase the economy and then create more jobs and create better livelihoods for people, or at least that was the sentiment that was being presented and portrayed by politicians at the time. Following the attack, which caused a huge blow on the American identity, which is very much tied to freedom under capitalism, consumption habits were framed as a way to take pride in one's country. Spending was almost considered a moral obligation. President George W. Bush stated that our financial institutions remained strong and that the American economy was still open for business. He then encouraged people to get down to Florida and go to Disney World to take your families and friends. According to Robert Reich, the Labor Secretary under President Bill Clinton, in an article published on September 23, 2001. The theory is that we demonstrate our resolve to the rest of the world by investing and consuming at least as much as we did before, preferably more. The terrorists tried to strike at the heart of American capitalism. We show that American capitalism is alive and well by giving it as much of our credit card as possible. Now, as a result, mass consumerism and consumption rose significantly in the early 2000s. In fact, some have even stated that this was part of the reason for the GFC. We also saw this rhetoric during the pandemic and the idea that spending on local businesses and ordering food online would ultimately be a patriotic and moral duty almost. To connect with humanity was to spend more money on things that would benefit your local community. According to Chip Colwell, consumerism has become a symbol of liberty and democratic equality in today's world. The idea goes, anyone can consume anything and thus be turned into the person that they want to be. In fact, many people don't even see consumption as an act of hedonism at all, but an act of love to show thoughtfulness for the people in their lives. Buying things at the grocery store or buying things at the mall demonstrate that you're thinking of others who would benefit from the aesthetic value or functionality of the item that you're going to bring back into your home. But the costs of mass consumption are also staggering. In the same article, Colwell went on to say the following: economic inequality and wars over non-renewable resources have killed untold numbers. The steep increase in products in recent decades has accelerated pollutant emissions, deforestation, and climate breakdown. It has depleted water supplies and contributed to rapid extinction of animals. There are vast garbage patches floating across the world's oceans, with infinite bits of microplastics working their way into the food webs. Even if we accept the positives of mass consumption to date, we must acknowledge that the situation is unsustainable. And yet, we can't seem to stop ourselves. The symbolic glow of consumption cannot be simply turned off. And not only is overconsumption demonstrative of a disregard for our environment, but it demonstrates a huge disconnect between the people who ultimately end up making a lot of the things we consume, particularly if it's fast fashion or at least mass produced, which is a lot of things in this world. A collection of, say, new Stanley Cups, as I said before, may bring you closer to other people who collect the same products, but arguably brings you a lot further away from those who made them, which is interesting in the context of collecting, because earlier I was talking about how a lot of people collect items because they want to be closer to those who created those items. They collect those ceramic pots because people handmade those pots. I don't think you can say the same for anyone that collects Stanley Cups. Quoting again from the essay written by Charlie Squire, to me, the difference between collecting and consumption portrayed as collecting is intent. A wall of unopened branded products functions not as a collection of unique goods, but a testament to its own size and worth. Individual objects do not exist to serve a specific purpose or display a unique voice, simply to complete an image. When I think of my old Playboys, my overly annotated paperbacks, or my patterned vintage button-downs, I don't think of them as market commodities gaining equity or parts of a prized set. Each object has been made, used, loved. The value in owning and holding these things arises from participating in a lineage of appreciation and craft. And perhaps most importantly, that value is inextractable, embedded into the essence and history of the object, something which arises through knowledge and care, demanding an active connoisseurship not easily appropriated by the market. And although it may sound like it, I'm not suggesting you need to go full Marie Kondo or pursue minimalism as the only solution to this problem. If minimalism works for you, that's amazing. Go off. But it doesn't work for anyone. I mean, for a number of different reasons. Firstly, not everyone is even able to be in a privileged position where less is more. In an example that was stated by Chelsea from The Financial Diet, she spoke of the notion of getting rid of a car. She said for her, getting rid of a car is actually an achievable thing because she lives in an area where footpaths are prioritized, or sidewalks for the Americans. Public transport is not only accessible, but it's reliable and it's good. The government has prioritized different transport options and has put money into not needing cars. Not everyone has that privilege. Not everyone is able to live in a place like that. And so to be able to just get rid of certain items indicates that you are living in a situation that's privileged enough to get by and live a sustainable, enjoyable life without them. And then there's the other side of the coin where a lot of people live with technically minimalist lifestyles, but only out of necessity because they can't afford excess. The idea to just become a minimalist is almost as privileged as owning every iteration of the new Glossier collection or owning every single Stanley Cup in every single color. They're both representative of elitism in their own right. In my view, I do think it's important to constantly evaluate why you're buying something and why you're bringing something into your life. I was watching this video the other day by Jasmine from That Curly Top where she spoke about how she wants to be more responsible for the items, or particularly the clothing items that she brings into her life. As soon as they're hers, she feels she has a responsibility over taking care of it. She gives the example of this item that she recently bought. I think it was a jumper, and she said that essentially when she wears it, unfortunately, it smells. Instead of just throwing it away though, she's decided to keep hold of it, and in fact one of the comments said she could potentially upcycle it into a bag. When you start to train your brain to hold on to things even when you don't really know whether or not you want it anymore, it reminds you of the permanence of these objects on the planet. Just because you throw it away doesn't mean it ceases to exist entirely. Sure, it ceases to exist in your wardrobe, but if it's in landfill, that's not much better. I think when we're reminded that clothing items or items in general are often not just disposable, it helps us really consider what it is that we want and why we want to bring new items into our lifestyle. Like, really consider as well, not just, oh, I want it because I want it, okay, I'll buy it. Actually questioning and criticizing your own thought patterns. And it sucks. I'm the first to acknowledge when you start questioning why you want things and you're faced with the hard truth that you just want it because you want it and because you saw an ad on Instagram and you think it looks cool and there's not really any functional need for it. That is the worst. That's like a kick to the stomach, because that's when you realize that you probably don't need it, or at least that's how I'm trying to live at the moment. For me, I've recently started doing swimming, like swimming laps, and I have one swimsuit that works totally fine for me. The other day, I decided I needed another one because, I needed one that was more chlorine tough and I needed one for this and that. Ultimately, I realized I was actually just looking because I wanted a different color. And hey, that's fine. But for me at the moment, I don't really have the space in my wardrobe or the finances to just be buying something if I want it in a different color. So I had to be faced with the rude shock that I would not be buying myself a new swimsuit because my current one is totally fine. So in that sense, I think it's actually a really good practice to think about the values that you hold and whether or not your purchases align with those values. And it can be a very personal, practice. I mean, if for you, collecting Stanley Cups really aligns with your values, go for it. But I think taking into consideration the fact that it could look a little like overconsumption and potentially is overconsumption, that could be something you factor into your consideration about whether or not you want to continue to buy them. So who's to blame though? When companies like Stanley shift their marketing strategies to try and create these collector consumer bases involving limited edition drops, which capitalize off of scarcity mindsets and vulnerabilities of consumers, blaming the consumer for overconsumption entirely isn't that fair. Fabricating the illusion of collectability has been a hugely successful marketing strategy recently, particularly in light of the fact that we are in a loneliness epidemic and people are craving connection with other people who share similar hobbies like collecting. The thing is, often it really is erring on the side of overconsumption rather than collecting. And although overconsumption does have a lot to do with consumer habits and behaviors, a lot of the time overconsumption is actually driven in the first place by overproduction. In Alan Schneeberg's view, consumption cannot be the leading factor in the expansion of production. Increased consumption may permit expanded production, but it does not generally cause it. Similarly, according to Max Weber, individual consumers don't really determine the direction of production in the modern world, which contradicts the belief that demand drives supply. He says, even though the consumer has to be in a position to buy, his wants are awakened and directed by the entrepreneur through advertising, which generally creates these artificial desires and needs. To use the Stanley Cup example again, it's not like it was the first ever sustainable, reusable drink bottle that ever existed on this planet. In fact, companies like Hydro Flask and Yeti were doing exceptionally well before the Stanley Cup came along. However, the Stanley Cup has created this illusion that you need it because it has all these different aesthetic colors. It has these accessories that you can add to it. It's cornered this market by becoming almost an identity. Buying 100 Stanley Cups just because we can gives us the illusion that we did it out of our own choice. We went to work and we earned our money, and then we were able to reward ourselves by consuming and buying all different iterations of the same cup. But that's okay because we want to be able to express ourselves with different cups, right? I would argue that it's actually very much related to how it's been advertised and not so much about individual consumer behaviors, because I can guarantee that if it wasn't for this intensive advertising and the way that it's been presented on apps like TikTok as needing hundreds of different colors of the same cups, we wouldn't be seeing so many people collecting multiples of the same thing, particularly in relation to Stanley Cups. I'm not talking about the Sonny Angel here. This advertising really centers around this false belief that purchasing more will make you happy, that having this particular item will advance your social status more so than anything else. And so for this reason, blaming consumers entirely is not really an effective strategy, nor is it fair. Sure, we can do our best to cut back, and this is not to say as consumers we're entirely passive. In fact, we have a lot of power when it comes to where we drive our consumer choices and where we show our interest. But it's these large corporations that are benefiting significantly from overconsumption that really need to shoulder responsibility for the environmental impact and the impact on our fellow people in this world that are making these products under often harsh labor conditions. They need to shoulder responsibility for that. It's not all in the consumer. Ultimately, in my view, it really is up to these corporations and governments to actually do something, but they're not just going to do something without lobbying and without consumer behavior and action. We do have a massive power, as I said before, as consumers to drive trends and drive consumer behavior. What we ultimately decide as a collective and how we use our money is actually kind of like a vote. At the same time, to actually redirect the impacts that overconsumption is having on our environment, we need governments and corporations to step up, because it's them who are inherently benefiting from the destruction of our planet. It's them who have really little incentive other than reputational damage to actually make an impact, because often the behaviors of these large corporations are driven by short-term profit-driven incentive. It's not necessarily driven by social responsibility. So I'm really interested in what you have to say with this video. I'm interested in whether or not you think that you can actually ethically consume and collect items like the Stanley Cup, or whether or not you think it is just glorified overconsumption, whether or not you think that collecting things like the Sonny Angel has any problematic overtones or undertones either. But once again, thank you so much for watching this video. If you want to keep up with me, I've been posting fairly regularly on Instagram, which I'll have linked here and in the description. I've also been posting a little bit on TikTok as well. And if you enjoyed this episode, please give it 5-star rating on Spotify and like and subscribe if you want to see more from me. Thanks again for watching this video, and I'll see you next time.